like my video, subscribe to my channel for more juicy.
You are going to be turned into this.
Come on, baby.
Lagos was known for its busy streets, vibrant markets, and the delicious food that filled the air. Among the many street vendors, one stood out, the kebab seller. His stall was always surrounded by crowds of hungry customers eager to taste his famous grilled meat. The kebabs were tender, juicy, and full of flavor, drawing people from all over the city. It was said that the kebab seller's meat was like no other. There was something about it that made it irresistible. What no one knew, however, was the horrifying truth behind the seller's success. His stall was not just a place to buy grilled meat, but the result of a sinister operation that took place behind the scenes. The kebab seller was no ordinary man. He was a ruthless criminal with a twisted mind. In the quiet of his home, he kept large industrial fridges, each big enough to hold several human bodies. Whenever he managed to kidnap someone, usually women or young men who wandered too far from the crowd, he would first freeze their bodies, trapping them in the ice-cold fridges. The freezing process preserved the bodies, and the seller could keep them for as long as he wanted. Once the bodies were frozen, he would cut them into pieces, slicing them carefully as if he were preparing a regular animal for cooking. But this was no animal. He chopped and skewered human flesh, seasoning it and grilling it over his fire. The smell of the grilled meat filled the air, and people came flocking to buy the kebabs, oblivious to the true nature of what they were eating. The kebab seller's operation was a well-kept secret, and his customers were none the wiser. He had built a reputation as a man of skill, a master of his craft. No one ever questioned where his meat came from, for it was always tender and flavorful, the kind of meat people craved on a hot day. His success only grew as he became a local legend. But in the privacy of his home, his monstrous secret was alive. The freezers were full, and he had no plans of stopping. His cruel actions went unnoticed, and as time passed, he continued to sell his delicious kebabs to the unsuspecting public. But little did he know, someone would soon come too close to the truth, and his reign of terror would begin to crumble. Chijioke had always been a regular at the kebab seller's stall. He was one of those customers who came by every other week to enjoy the delicious kebabs that had become the talk of the town. He loved the smoky aroma, the tender texture, and the way the meat practically melted in his mouth. For months, Chijioke had been eating the kebabs without a second thought, believing the seller's meat came from a local butcher. But as time passed, he started hearing strange rumors. People whispered that the seller's meat was different, too perfect, too tender, too delicious to be just ordinary beef or goat. Curious but skeptical, Chijioke decided to visit the kebab seller's house one day. He had heard that the seller sometimes offered special cuts of meat to loyal customers, and he thought it might be nice to get some fresh kebabs directly from the source. So one evening, after finishing work, he took a taxi to the kebab seller's house, which was located a little outside the bustling streets of Lagos. When he arrived, the kebab seller greeted him with a warm smile, as if he had been expecting him. "Ah, Chijioke, I knew you'd come," he said, his voice as smooth as always. The seller led him inside, offering him a drink and asking if he was ready to take a look at the freshest cuts of meat he had. Chijioke, unaware of the horrors hidden behind the warm facade, followed him into the house. The interior was modest, but there was an odd chill in the air, as if the house itself had never truly warmed up. The seller led Chijioke through a hallway toward a room at the back, where the freezers were stored. The door to the room opened with a loud creak, and the first thing Chijioke noticed was the overpowering smell of coldness, mixed with the faint scent of meat. The seller flipped a switch, illuminating the dimly lit room, and motioned for Chijioke to come closer. "These are my finest cuts," the kebab seller said, opening one of the large freezers. He pulled out a slab of frozen meat, but Chijioke wasn't paying attention to it. Instead, his eyes were drawn to a figure in the corner of the freezer. His heart skipped a beat when he saw it. A human body, stiff and frozen, with a pale complexion that seemed unnatural in the cold light. Chijioke's breath caught in his throat, and he took a step back in shock. What is this?" he stammered, his voice trembling. The kebab seller turned around, his face turning cold, no longer bearing the same friendly expression. "That, my friend," he said, his voice now low and menacing, is the cost of good meat. Chijioke's heart raced as he took another step back, his mind trying to process what he had just seen. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The seller's gaze locked onto him, and in an instant, Chijioke realized that he had made a terrible mistake. Before Chijioke could react, the seller lunged at him. With one swift motion, he kicked Chijioke hard in the chest, sending him sprawling to the cold concrete floor. Pain shot through his body, but before he could recover, the seller grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward the open freezer. "No one leaves once they've seen what they shouldn't," the seller muttered, his voice filled with a dark determination. Chijioke struggled, but the seller's grip was too strong. He was thrown into the freezer with terrifying force, and the door slammed shut, plunging him into freezing darkness. The cold seeped into his bones, and he could feel his strength waning as the temperature dropped. His mind raced, desperately searching for an escape, but the seller's words echoed in his head. No one leaves. Trapped in the icy darkness, Chijioke's body began to freeze. Panic set in as he realized that no one would know where he was. He had seen too much, and now his life was forfeit. His only hope was that someone, anyone, might notice his disappearance before it was too late. Shira had always been an adventurous spirit, and when she heard about the kebab seller's famous meat, she couldn't resist trying it for herself. The rumors had intrigued her. People spoke of how tender and flavorful the meat was, claiming it was the best in Lagos. At first, Shira had dismissed the gossip as exaggeration, but as more and more people talked about it, her curiosity grew. One evening, as she walked through the busy streets of Lagos with her ex-boyfriend Peter, she mentioned the kebab seller. Peter immediately became uneasy. "You should stay away from that place," he warned, his voice tinged with concern. "I've heard some weird things about that seller. It's not normal to have meat that good. It's too perfect, you know?" Shira laughed, dismissing his fears. "Oh, come on, Peter. It's just food. People are always overreacting." She gave him a playful nudge, trying to brush off his warnings. But Peter wasn't convinced. "I'm serious, Shira. Something about that place doesn't sit right with me. I've heard stories about customers disappearing, people who went there and never came back." His words were serious, his gaze piercing through her playful facade. Shira rolled her eyes. "You worry too much," she said, but Peter's anxiety only deepened. He knew something was wrong, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Shira was in danger. After all, he still cared about her, even if they had broken up. The next day, Shira, undeterred by Peter's warnings, decided to visit the kebab seller's stall. She was determined to taste the legendary meat everyone was raving about. She walked through the crowded streets, her thoughts focused on the delicious kebabs she was about to enjoy. She knew Peter wouldn't be happy, but she was sure he was just being overly protective. As Shira approached the stall, the kebab seller greeted her with a warm smile. "Ah, you've come to try my famous meat," he said, his voice smooth and inviting. Shira smiled back, impressed by his friendly demeanor. "I've heard a lot about it," she replied. "I'm excited to see what all the fuss is about." The seller handed her a plate of freshly grilled kebabs, and Shira took a bite. The meat was tender, just like everyone had said, and the flavor was unlike anything she had ever tasted. She took another bite, savoring the rich taste. But then the seller handed her a glass of water. "Here, have a drink. It'll make the meat taste even better," he said, his smile widening. Shira, feeling the effects of the rich food, took a sip. The cool liquid slid down her throat, and within moments her vision began to blur. She felt dizzy, her body growing heavy. Something was wrong. The water had been laced with a drug, and Shira's body betrayed her as she fell into unconsciousness. Peter, who had been following her from a distance, watched in horror as she collapsed. He had been worried, but now the fear was real. He rushed forward, but it was too late. The kebab seller, with alarming speed, scooped Shira into his arms and began carrying her toward his house. Peter's heart pounded as he realized what was happening. Peter's heart raced as he watched the kebab seller disappear into the distance, carrying Shira in his arms. His mind was in a frenzy, knowing that every second counted. He had to stop this madness, but how? The seller had drugged Shira and was now taking her to his house. There was no telling what horrors awaited her there. Peter couldn't allow that to happen. With no time to lose, he quickly ducked into an alleyway, away from prying eyes, and started running. His footsteps echoed in the empty streets as he kept his gaze fixed on the seller, now several meters ahead. He had no idea where the kebab seller lived, but he had heard people mention that his house was located at the edge of the city, far from the bustling markets and crowded neighborhoods. Peter's only hope was that the seller wasn't taking a different route, one that might lead him astray. He couldn't lose sight of him. The night air was thick with tension as Peter followed, carefully keeping his distance. His thoughts flashed back to all the strange things he had heard about the kebab seller, how people had whispered that something wasn't right, that no one really knew where he got his meat. He had heard rumors of missing persons and bizarre stories of people who had disappeared after eating at the seller's stall. But now, with Shara unconscious and vulnerable, Peter knew he had to stop this madness. The streets grew quieter as the kebab seller veered off the main road, heading into a more desolate part of the city. Peter followed cautiously, his legs aching from the running, but he couldn't afford to stop. He had to make sure he reached the seller's house before it was too late. Eventually, the kebab seller turned onto a narrow dirt road that led to a small, isolated house at the edge of the city. It was dark, with only a few faint lights flickering from nearby homes far off in the distance. The house itself appeared run down and weathered, but Peter's instincts told him that something far more sinister lay behind its walls. He hid behind a nearby tree, watching as the seller carried Shara inside. Peter's chest tightened. He had reached the house, but he was unsure what to do next. He couldn't just rush in. He needed a plan, a way to get Shara out without putting them both in danger. He quickly scanned his surroundings, his eyes landing on a large stone by the side of the road. An idea sparked in his mind. Peter wasn't one to act recklessly, but this was different. He couldn't stand by while the kebab seller carried out his twisted plan. He picked up the stone and gripped it tightly, his pulse quickening. His heart pounded in his ears as he prepared himself for what needed to be done. The stone was heavy, but it was the only weapon he had. He didn't want to harm anyone, but he knew he had no choice. It was a matter of life or death. With a deep breath, Peter ran toward the house, keeping low and moving swiftly through the shadows. He reached a spot where he could see through the window and watched as the kebab seller began to prepare one of the freezers. The seller was so focused on his task that he didn't notice Peter creeping closer. Just as the kebab seller bent down to open the freezer door, Peter acted. He hurled the stone with all his strength, and it struck the seller square in the back of the head. The seller staggered forward, stunned by the impact, and fell to the ground. His grip on Shara loosened, and she slipped from his arms, her body still limp from the drug. Peter rushed inside, ignoring the thumping of his heart in his chest. He knelt beside Shara, checking to make sure she was still breathing. Her pulse was weak but steady. With no time to lose, he gently lifted her into his arms, determined to get her out of the house. Before he could move, however, the kebab seller groaned and began to stir. His eyes flickered open, and when he saw Peter holding Shara, his face twisted into a look of pure rage. The kebab seller wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered, his voice low and filled with malice. "You're too late." Peter's heart raced, but he didn't back down. He looked around for anything that could help him, but there was nothing. The house was dark, filled with only the faint hum of the freezers and the sounds of the seller's anger rising. But Peter wasn't afraid anymore. He was angry. Angry at the seller for what he had done, angry that this man had turned people into meat, angry that he had nearly lost Shara. Without hesitation, Peter shoved the kebab seller aside and ran toward the door, carrying Shara in his arms. The seller lunged after him, but Peter was faster. Peter dashed outside and into the cold night air, his legs burning from the effort. He kept running, knowing he had to get Shara out of the seller's grasp once and for all. As he ran, he fumbled for his phone, knowing that he needed to call the police before it was too late. Peter's mind raced as he sprinted through the streets, holding Shara tightly. His phone finally unlocked, and he dialed the police, his voice shaking as he described the situation. "I need help. There's a man, a kebab seller. He's been kidnapping people. Please, you have to hurry." The dispatcher on the other end of the line assured him that help was on the way, but Peter knew time was running out. The cellar was close behind, and even though the man was older, he was still dangerous. Peter's thoughts were consumed with making sure Shira was okay. He checked her breathing again and found it steady, but she still hadn't regained consciousness. As Peter neared a more populated area, he heard sirens in the distance. Relief flooded his chest, but he didn't stop running. He couldn't take any chances. He had to get her to safety, and he had to make sure the cellar couldn't hurt anyone else. Minutes later, the police arrived, and Peter pointed them toward the house where the kebab seller had taken Shira. The officers rushed inside, quickly apprehending the seller, who struggled and cursed as they placed him in handcuffs. His reign of terror was finally over. Shira slowly began to stir as Peter knelt beside her, her eyes fluttering open. She was disoriented, but when she saw Peter's face, recognition dawned in her eyes. Without warning, she threw her arms around him, her body shaking as the reality of what had nearly happened hit her. "Thank you, Peter. I don't know what I would have done without you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Peter hugged her back, his own heart full of relief. "You don't have to thank me. I couldn't let him hurt you." As the police led the kebab seller away, Peter and Shira stood together, their lives forever changed by the terrifying ordeal. Shira was safe, and the nightmare was finally over. Peter smiled softly as he pulled away, but his heart was heavy. He had saved her, but the memory of the horror they had just escaped would stay with them both forever. And as Shira looked at him with gratitude in her eyes, Peter realized that sometimes love and loyalty meant being there when it mattered most.